In 1791, the most incriminating evidence inside the president's house in Philadelphia is not a weapon or a confession or a scream. It is a schedule. Philadelphia was the seat of the federal government then. George Washington lived here at the Executive Mansion on Market Street, while the country told itself a story about liberty with a straight face. But Pennsylvania had already written a different story into law. In 1780, the Commonwealth passed its Gradual Abolition Act. Among its provisions was a rule that mattered in one specific, measurable way: continuous residence. Stay long enough, uninterrupted, and an enslaved person could claim freedom under Pennsylvania's framework. That is the part people remember. What they do not remember, what they were not encouraged to remember, is how quickly powerful people learned to game the clock. Because in the papers from this period, you can watch the moral language collapse into administrative language. You can see exactly where human life becomes a compliance problem. On April 24, 1791, Tobias Lear, Washington's secretary, puts the method into writing. The advice is cold, practical, and devastating. If the enslaved workers could be carried out of Pennsylvania but for a single day, then a new era would commence when they returned, and the 6 months would have to start over. Read that again, because the sentence does not just describe a loophole. It describes a policy designed to stop freedom from becoming legally real. Not by argument, not by court challenge, not by admitting anything openly, by moving a person across a boundary briefly so the calendar forgets them. This is the part that demands we speak plainly. This was not an accident. This was not confusion. This was not the Times, as if time itself drafted the paperwork. This was intent, and it wasn't theoretical. The historical record and modern interpretation agree on the practice. Washington's household exploited the residency rule by rotating enslaved people out of Pennsylvania before the threshold could be met. A human being is in Philadelphia. Time begins to count. A day trip happens. A return happens. Time is ordered to pretend it never counted at all. Now, when you hear rotation, it sounds like logistics, something you do with staff, with shifts, with inventory. That is exactly why the word is useful. It is a euphemism that does the work of silence. What was being rotated was not labor, it was legal exposure. And the people inside that exposure, people with names, skills, fears, relationships, were treated as variables that could be rearranged to protect reputation and property. In 1788, Pennsylvania tried to close loopholes and curb abuses through an amendment. The point was obvious: stop people from abusing the system through technicalities. But by 1791, the household of the President of the United States is discussing how to keep the practice invisible, how to do it under a pretext that could deceive the enslaved people themselves and the public. That phrase matters, because it tells you what this was: not merely evasion, but concealment. Deception wasn't a byproduct, it was part of the plan. And if you are tempted to soften that, if you want to call it complicated or legally uncertain, or a clash of jurisdictions, then you are already participating in what the record was built to accomplish, because the record was not designed to count bodies. It was designed to manage liability. It was designed to make freedom a near miss over and over until the story of liberty could proceed uninterrupted. And then, in 1796, the system meets a person who refuses to stay inside the schedule. On May 21, 1796, an enslaved woman named Ona Judge walks out of the president's house in Philadelphia and does not come back. That is not a footnote. That is a rupture. Because her escape is the moment the paperwork stops being abstract. It becomes a hunt. It becomes public. It becomes evidence that the rotation was never neutral management. It was containment. From this point forward, you can watch the same machine shift gears. From quiet clock resetting to active retrieval, the language changes, the purpose does not. So here is the claim I am making at the start, and I will prove it with receipts. In 1791, the president's household learned how to erase time. And when a government learns to erase time for the purpose of keeping people enslaved, it is not merely breaking a rule. It is manufacturing silence. And silence, especially when it is written into procedure, is never neutral. It is a choice that has victims. It is a choice that produces missing stories on purpose. Our responsibility is not to admire the architecture of the loophole. Our responsibility is to name what the loophole did. Because if we do not record the method, then the method survives. Cleaned up, renamed, repeated. And that is what this story is about. People will tell you the president's house in Philadelphia was a symbol of beginnings, temporary capital, early governance, the performance of Republican virtue. They will point to the 1790s and describe a young nation learning how to stand upright. That is the official story. Here is the missing story. The same house operated as a testing ground for how to make slavery survive inside a jurisdiction that was trying, imperfectly, cautiously, to dismantle it. The record does not support the myth that what happened here was accidental or incidental or complicated in a way that excuses the outcome. The omissions were decisions. The decisions repeat. That is how you know it was policy, not confusion. In the 1790s, at 6th and Market Streets, George Washington lived and conducted executive business in the president's house, and he brought enslaved Africans into that household. The National Park Service does not present this as rumor. It is stated as fact, because it is fact. Now listen carefully to what that means. This house sat in the shadow of Independence Hall, words about equality and we the people within walking distance, while human beings were held as property inside the executive residence. The contradiction was not theoretical. It had names. It had routines. It had paperwork. And this is where the two archives begin. There is the official archive, the public language of leadership, the sanitized terms, the household management notes, the legal hedging. It is a record designed to protect stature. And there is the human archive, the things preserved because people refuse to let them disappear. Abolition networks, free black community memory, the fact that an enslaved person's absence can be louder than 100 pages of polite correspondence. When I say missing story, I do not mean lost. I mean withheld. I mean managed. Because the break in the record is not random. It aligns with incentives. Pennsylvania did something in 1780 that forced slave-holding elites to choose between adapting and confronting. On March 1st, 1780, Pennsylvania passed its gradual abolition law. It did not end slavery immediately. It compromised. It negotiated with enslavers. But it created legal levers, registration requirements, constraints on holding people in bondage, and a logic that could be invoked in court. And it created one specific danger for any enslaver who brought enslaved people into Pennsylvania. Time. 6 months mattered. Continuity mattered. The state created a framework where extended presence could become a pathway to a legal claim. Most people stop here because it is comfortable to stop here. You can say, Pennsylvania was ahead. You can say, the North was different. You can say, progress was underway. But progress is not a self-executing statute. Progress is enforced, or it is evaded. So here is the sentence that breaks the textbook narrative. The president's household learned how to make 6 months never happen, not once, repeatedly. The National Park Service describes Washington's behavior in unambiguous terms. While president, he attempted to bypass Pennsylvania's framework by repeatedly rotating enslaved people between his residences to keep them enslaved. That is not an interpretation. That is a documented pattern. And the paper trail does not merely show that the pattern existed. It shows that it was discussed like a solvable operational problem. This is where we stop pretending the record is neutral. In 1790, Philadelphia became the nation's capital for a period, and the president's house at 6th and Market became the practical center of the executive branch. That is the public fact. Here is the private fact that sits underneath it. The executive residence had to function in a city where abolitionists watched closely, where free black communities existed openly, and where state law created risk. Risk does not always trigger moral reflection. Sometimes it triggers procurement. By procurement, I do not only mean purchasing goods, I mean acquiring solutions, legal advice, logistical routes, staffing substitutes, and procedures that keep a household running without triggering a legal claim. The receipts begin to tighten in 1791. In April 1791, Tobias Lear, Washington's secretary, writes and reports a problem. The Pennsylvania law is being invoked. Enslaved people in another household have announced they will claim freedom. The precedent is obvious. The Washington household could be next. Washington's reply is not the reply of a man confused about what the law means. It is the reply of a man who understands the stakes and instructs that the response must be hidden. He states plainly that if legal advice indicates emancipation attempts might occur at the 6-month mark, the enslaved people should be sent out of state, and he wants it done under a pretext that will deceive both them and the public. That phrasing is not decoration. It is the mechanism. When a leader instructs deception as a method, you are no longer observing passive participation in an unjust system. You are observing administration. You are observing intent. You are observing a decision to make law meaningless without challenging it openly. And if anyone tries to dilute that, the record does not allow it. Another document in the same chain makes the operational logic explicit. If the enslaved people could be taken out of Pennsylvania but for a single day, then a new era would commence when they returned, meaning the clock resets and the 6 months must begin again. This is not a metaphor, it is a reset button. That sentence is not spoken by an enemy, it is not shouted by a critic. It is written down inside the president's orbit, treated as sensible advice, and then immediately translated into movement plans. And the plans are not hypothetical. The letter lays out individuals and routes. One person already absent, another sent by vessel to Virginia, a proposal to send Hercules home, and a planned excursion to Trenton that would carry Ona and Christopher out of Pennsylvania. That is the rotation. It is not a vague allegation, it is a list. This is where the moral record becomes prosecutorial, because what you are seeing is the conversion of human beings into calendar management. The state creates a path toward freedom, the household creates a path around it, and the path around it is short, convenient, and repeatable. A 1-mile boat ride can become an instrument of captivity. If you want to understand why this qualifies as a buried record, it is because it can hide in plain sight. It can be recorded as travel, errands, household necessity. The cruelty is distributed across decisions that each appear mundane until you line them up and notice they form a system. That is what this investigation does. It aligns the mundane into a pattern you cannot unsee. Now consider the timeline, because dates matter. 1780. Pennsylvania passes its gradual abolition law. As 1788, Pennsylvania amends and clarifies aspects of its approach, attempting to address abuses and loopholes in practice. 1790. Philadelphia becomes the functional capital, and the President's House becomes the executive residence. 1791. The Washington household discusses, on paper, how to prevent enslaved people from acquiring the time needed to claim freedom, specifically through brief removals that restart the clock. That is not a story about a different era. That is a story about an institution learning a technique, comply publicly, evade privately, and keep the victims off the official stage. And this is where the official story becomes not merely incomplete, but dishonest. Because the official story depends on the idea that liberty was the defining project of the early republic. Yet inside the president's house, the defining project, documented in letters, was how to keep liberty from attaching to specific people. That is why names become a recurring problem in this record. The powerful are named fully. Their correspondence is preserved, transcribed, archived, honored. The enslaved are named when their names are needed for management, to assign tasks, to schedule movements, to calculate risk. In the letter, Washington refers to enslaved people as dour Negroes, and he frames emancipation not as injustice ending, but as financial loss and liability. He says he must prevent it or he will lose their labor and may have to pay for them. That is the voice of property speaking through law, and I am not presenting this as scandal for entertainment. I am presenting it because this is where responsibility begins. We do not inherit the past as a neutral collection of stories. We inherit it as a fight over what gets remembered and what gets denied. When a president asks for a deception to deceive both them and the public becomes complicit if it chooses not to look. That is the quiet moral demand of this record. Not that you feel outrage for a moment, but that you accept the duty to remember accurately. Because the method is reusable. A legal right is created. The powerful do not argue against the right. They manipulate the conditions so the right cannot mature. The record is kept in clean handwriting. Later generations call it complicated. And the victims' names, unless someone reconstructs them, fade into the background noise of history. That is how bodies become uncounted, without anyone needing to dig a pit in the open. This is also why the phrase silence as policy is not rhetorical. Silence is created by procedure, by a schedule that prevents claims, by movements that leave no dramatic event behind, by language that turns a person into a case, a servant, a problem, an arrangement. And once silence is procedural, it can outlive the people who designed it. So before we go any further, I want to make a commitment to the only standard that matters in a story like this, the receipts. The receipts are not always theatrical. They are often worse than theatrical. They are calm. They are practical. They are written by people who knew exactly what they were doing. And in 1791, the record shows the president's household did not merely benefit from slavery while living in Philadelphia. It actively engineered a workaround to keep enslaved people from becoming legally free under Pennsylvania's framework, through brief removals designed to reset time and through instructions to conceal that purpose from the enslaved and from the public. That is the missing story. And now that it has been stated plainly, it cannot be put back in the box without choosing amnesia. In this house, the work was constant. The public saw receptions, dinners, visitors in polished clothing, a government presenting itself as civilized. The public did not see the machinery that made the performance possible. The record admits that machinery, but only in the way a ledger admits a nail, as an object, not a life. The National Park Service identifies 9 enslaved Africans brought from Mount Vernon into the Philadelphia presidential household: Austin, Paris, Hercules, Christopher Shields, Richmond, Giles, Ona Judge, Maul, and Joe. 9 names, 9 lives. And in the paperwork, you can already see the first step of erasure. Most of the time, they are not recorded with full identity. They are recorded as function. They are recorded as property. They are recorded as risk. That is what the workforce means in a record like this. People reduced to labor categories so the conscience can remain clean. Look at what the official language does. A cook becomes a tool of hospitality. A driver becomes a movement problem. A personal attendant becomes an object that can be relocated to keep the calendar from maturing into freedom. Even the names are unstable. Ona becomes Oni in some records. Christopher Shields becomes Shields or Sheets, depending on who is holding the pen. That instability is not harmless. It is how a person becomes harder to trace, easier to misfile, easier to lose in plain sight. And when people say, records were messy back then, understand what that excuse is doing. It is offering the institution a comfortable fog. It is asking you to accept that the paper failed. But in this story, the paper does not fail where it matters to the powerful. The powerful are named precisely. Their correspondence is preserved, copied, indexed. Their decisions travel across centuries with signatures intact. The enslaved are preserved only to the extent that management requires it. The most revealing document is not a dramatic accusation. It is a calm description of technique. Enslaved people can be carried out of Pennsylvania, but for a single day, and a new era would commence on their return, meaning the 6 months reset. Wikipedia. The workforce is not just working. The workforce is being scheduled against the law, and when a person is scheduled as a legal workaround, the record is telling you something. It is telling you that slavery here was not merely inherited, it was maintained through active planning. Now take these 9 names and refuse to let them remain a list, because the list is how the record tries to end the conversation. It is the institutional minimum. Yes, there were enslaved people. Next topic. No. The obligation is to insist on detail, because detail is where the moral reality becomes undeniable. Start with Hercules. Mount Vernon's own historical encyclopedia identifies Hercules Posey as an enslaved cook for Washington in the 1780s and 1790s, renowned in his lifetime, and it states plainly that he self-emancipated in 1797. In the official story, dinners are diplomacy. In the missing story, dinners are built on coerced expertise, skill extracted without consent, then displayed as evidence of refinement. A famous cook in the president's house is not proof of benevolence. It is proof that talent does not protect you from being treated as property. Then there is Austin. The National Park Service records that Austin died on December 20th, 1794, after a fall from a horse, leaving a wife and 5 children. You should sit with that. Even when the record acknowledges death, it acknowledges it as an incident, not as an indictment. The system that placed him in harm's way remains unnamed. The widow's fate fades. The children become inheritance. The body becomes a footnote under a date. Then Christopher Shields. The National Park Service describes him as Washington's personal attendant, literate, and notes that he attempted to escape in 1799 but was unsuccessful. That single fact, literate attempted escape, should destroy any sanitized reading of household service. Literacy does not equal proximity to freedom. Proximity to power does not equal safety. The most intimate role in the household still sits under the same structure, ownership. Then Giles. The National Park Service describes him as a driver, postilion, and stable hand. It notes that he returned to Mount Vernon in 1791 after being injured in an accident during Washington's Southern tour, and that he died before 1799. In other words, the work is movement. The work is risk. Injury is treated as logistics. Return is treated as management. Death is treated as timing, before 1799, because the exact end of an enslaved person's life is not consistently valued as a recordable fact. Now Ona Judge. Mount Vernon's historical page states that Ona Judge fled on May 21, 1796, and it preserves her later recollection. She understood that returning to Virginia meant never getting her liberty. The National Park Service also records her escape from the president's house in Philadelphia on that same date. Her story matters here not as inspiration, but as exposure. If the system were humane, it would not require flight. If the household were benign, it would not need to be escaped. And her story shows the true function of the free black community in Philadelphia, not a footnote, but an alternative archive. The National Park Service explicitly notes that Philadelphia's large free black community, coupled with Quaker anti-slavery stance, meant networks existed to assist people seeking freedom. Those networks are why silence as policy could not fully succeed. People spoke to each other. People assisted each other. People remembered what institutions wished to forget. And then there are the names about which the official record says less. Mall, Richmond, Paris, Joe. Names that appear in lists attached to rolls, then thin out into fragments. This is the architecture of erasure. You allow the world to know there were some enslaved people, but you deny the world enough detail to feel the weight of a single life. This is why the moral demand of this story is not outrage. It is accounting. Because the institution already did accounting, just not the kind that recognizes humanity. It counted labor. It counted risk. It counted time. It counted which side of a state line a body stood on. And it treated names as movable parts in the counting. Now move from the people to the conditions that contained them, because the record is careful here too. It will tell you who did what, and when someone died, and when someone escaped. It will not describe daily captivity in language that sounds like cruelty. That silence is not accidental. Silence is part of the design. Consider what working in the president's house actually meant in the 1790s. It meant waking before the household's public life began, because the public life required a hidden labor life underneath it. It meant stables and horses, because a postilion and stable hands are not decorative roles. The National Park Service places Giles in that world. Driver, postilion, stable hand, and records injury as a consequence. It meant kitchens that never truly closed, because the executive residence is a political machine, and the Mount Vernon historical record places Hercules in that kitchen role, enslaved cook, renowned, and it records his self-emancipation in 1797, which tells you the conditions were not a privilege that softened captivity. It meant personal attendance that required intimacy without autonomy. Christopher Shields is described as a personal attendant. The same record tells you he attempted to escape in 1799. And it meant living in a city where freedom was visible and plausible, where the law created pathways, where free black residents existed in large numbers, and where networks to assist freedom seekers were known. That last point is critical because it adds a particular kind of pressure, the psychological pressure of proximity. Captivity in a place with no visible alternative is one kind of horror. Captivity in a place where the alternative exists a few streets away is another. It is the horror of near-touch freedom that is continuously withheld, and the household understood that. That is why the paper trail focuses on time, borders, and removal. The loophole itself is described in stark terms by historical interpretation. Even a single day out of Pennsylvania could prevent the establishment of a 6-month residency, and New Jersey was only a short ride away. That is the condition that matters most in this segment, the condition of being managed as a residency problem. When the household removes someone briefly to reset the clock, it is not merely moving labor. It is disciplining the future. It is preventing the law from attaching to the person long enough to do what it threatens to do. And I want to be precise about what that means morally. This is not lawful. It is legal sabotage. It is the intentional defeat of a law's purpose while pretending respect for the law's existence. That is why the tone of this record is so chilling. It does not need chains in the text. It needs only procedure. Procedure decides whether you may remain in the state long enough to claim a right. Procedure decides whether your name stays in a ledger long enough to be remembered. Procedure decides whether your absence is recorded as escape or erased as reassignment. Now we return to the first major incident the record is willing to admit because it reveals how violence is handled when it cannot be hidden entirely. Austin's death on December 20th, 1794 is recorded. Fall from a horse. Wife and 5 children survive him. Ask yourself what is missing from that sentence. There is no inquiry into whether the work was coerced. There is no inquiry into whether risk was increased by the demands of service. There is no inquiry into whether the household owed anything to the widow and children beyond the cold fact that they exist. This is how bodies uncounted can coexist with documentation. The record can acknowledge a body only as a disruption to operations, not as a human catastrophe that demands accountability. The same pattern appears in Giles's injury, documented in 1791, injury during a tour, return to Mount Vernon, eventual death before 1799. Again, the record will tell you the minimum it must tell you, and it will not describe what it would mean to live as the person behind the line item. And when the record does not describe conditions, the institution benefits twice. First, it prevents sympathy from becoming too specific. Second, it keeps the focus on the celebrated surface, the presidency, the pageantry, while the coercion remains in the shadows, implied but not narrated. That is why it matters that we insist on naming the conditions even when the archive will not do it for us, not by inventing scenes, not by indulging in melodrama, by stating what the roles necessarily imply. A stable hand in a presidential household implies physical danger and constant readiness. A cook implies heat, sharp tools, pressure, and the demand to be invisible until the food appears as if by magic. A personal attendant implies surveillance at close range and punishment for errors that others would call minor. And all of it implies the central condition: you do not own your time, your movement, your family, or your future. That condition is documented not through poetic language, but through the very existence of the rotation strategy and the escape it provoked. Ona Judge's escape on May 21, 1796, documented by both Mount Vernon and the National Park Service, is not simply an event. It is a verdict. It tells you what it felt like inside the system, enough to risk everything for the chance to live beyond it. And it tells you what the household feared, not disorder, but precedent. Because once one person proves the schedule can be broken, every line item becomes unstable. So here is the point I will not soften. The workforce in the president's house was not merely enslaved people who happened to be there. It was a deliberately managed set of human beings brought into a jurisdiction with anti-slavery law and a free black community, then systematically moved and controlled so that the law's promise would not mature into freedom. And the conditions were not an unfortunate backdrop. They were the environment in which the policy could function: surveillance, forced labor, risk, and the constant threat of being relocated, not for care, not for safety, but to erase time. That is what silence as policy looks like in daily life. Not a gag, not a locked room, a routine that never writes down what it is doing in plain moral language because plain language would make denial impossible. Our responsibility is to refuse that denial, to keep the names stable when the record tries to make them slippery, to keep the dates sharp when the institution prefers haze, to treat each fragment not as trivia, but as evidence. Because if the early republic could build an executive household on a schedule engineered to defeat freedom, then founding is not only a story of creation, it is also a story of what was deliberately kept from becoming true. The first thing you learn when you stop trusting the official story is that disappearance rarely announces itself. It doesn't arrive with a headline. It arrives as a blank space where a person should have been, and a new name written in the margin like a harmless correction. It arrives as a temporary removal that becomes permanent in everything except the paperwork. In Philadelphia in the early 1790s, the president's house ran on 2 clocks. One clock was public, receptions, governance, the performance of order. The other clock was private, the 6-month threshold, time measured not in days but in legal danger. And the record makes one thing unmistakably clear: the household treated that 6-month danger as something to be managed, not respected. By April 1791, the method is not rumor. It is written down as operational guidance. A person can be taken out of Pennsylvania, but for a single day, and the clock restarts. The language is surgical. It reduces freedom to a timer you can reset with a short trip. This is where the first vanishings begin, not vanishings as in mystery, but vanishings as in deliberate administrative removal. Because when you remove someone for a day to erase 6 months, you create a problem the record is built to hide. A person must disappear from Pennsylvania long enough to break continuous residence, and then reappear as if nothing happened. That movement is the crime scene, and it does not require chains in the text. It requires only 3 things: authority, logistics, and silence. Look at how the household writes about it in 1791. It lists people by function. It talks about sending individuals away to Virginia. It considers routes that move enslaved people out of the state under cover of normal travel. Trenton, across the river, just far enough to wipe the calendar clean. The telling detail is not only that removal is discussed. It is that removal is paired with a second instruction: conceal the reason. Do it under a pretext. Keep the enslaved from understanding what is being done to their time. Keep the public from seeing it. That is not managing a household. That is managing exposure. And once exposure management becomes routine, you start seeing the human cost the way the institution sees it, as substitutions. One person is sent away, another is brought in. One name leaves the state, another name appears in the house. The ledger stays balanced. The labor continues. The public story remains polished, but the human story fractures. Here is what matters. This system did not require a single dramatic act of violence to function. It relied on small, repeatable movements that turned people into movable parts. If you are tempted to think that makes it less severe, understand the opposite is true. Because a brutality that can be repeated quietly is the kind that lasts. A brutality that can be written down as travel is the kind that survives in respectable archives. That is why I call this a buried record, not because it is hidden in a vault, because it is hidden inside ordinary language. And this is where the first substitution pattern becomes visible. When enslaved people are rotated out of Pennsylvania to reset time, the record doesn't say, "We did this to prevent legal freedom." It says something that sounds like logistics: an errand, a visit, a return home, a necessary trip. The result is the same. The person's continuous presence is broken by design, and the law is neutralized without being challenged openly. A right is created and then suffocated by procedure. Now, if you want to understand how dangerous this question becomes, where did they go? You have to understand what's at stake inside that 6-month window. If an enslaved person remained continuously in Pennsylvania long enough, they could claim a legal foothold that terrified enslavers who lived off the assumption that human beings could be carried across lines like furniture. So the household didn't merely enforce captivity. It enforced short horizons. It made sure no one could remain long enough to acquire the time that law could recognize. And this is where the story becomes darker than the usual moral fable about founding contradictions. Because this is not a contradiction. This is an active countermeasure. A state attempts, however cautiously, to create a legal path away from slavery. The president's household designs a method to keep that path from being walked. When you see it that way, the vanishings are not random. They are the expected output of the method. A person disappears from the city, briefly, strategically, so that the state cannot count them. A person returns, and the law is forced to pretend it is day one again. And the person lives under a terrible, repeatable lesson. Your time will be stolen even when you are not being physically struck. Your time will be erased by paperwork. That is why this is not merely historical. It is instructive. Because every institution that wants to avoid accountability learns the same trick. It doesn't have to deny the law. It only has to prevent the law from attaching to a person long enough to matter. Now we enter the peak window, the period when a citywide crisis makes silence easier to maintain and disappearance easier to disguise. The year is 1793. In the summer and fall of 1793, Philadelphia is hit by a yellow fever epidemic that kills thousands. The outbreak accelerates through August, intensifies through September, peaks in October, and only abates toward late November when cold weather disrupts the conditions that spread it. The city's population collapses under fear. People who can flee do. Institutions falter. Government officials leave. Business shutters. Streets empty. Public order becomes fragile. And in the middle of that, the federal government's household, the president's household, does what powerful households do in a crisis. It preserves itself. George Washington leaves Philadelphia during the epidemic and goes to Mount Vernon in 1793. That is the public fact. But in this investigation, we treat public facts as the top layer, not the full story. Because the departure of the president is not merely travel, it is a movement of power away from scrutiny. It is a shrinking of oversight. It is a moment when the city's attention is consumed by mass death, and the private machinery of enslavement can operate with even less resistance. A crisis like this does two things at once. It produces real death everywhere, death that overwhelms record-keeping, and it produces cover for policies that depend on confusion and silence. When the city is counting bodies by the thousand, individual lives become easier to misplace, easier to mislabel, easier to erase. That is why I call this a peak event window. Not because I am claiming a single spectacular atrocity happened inside the president's house during the epidemic. The darkness is more procedural than that. The darkness is that a system already designed to erase time is now operating in a city where time itself, ordinary life, has been disrupted. The household has already learned to exploit borders and schedules. Now it operates in an environment where the public is desperate, where the sick are abandoned, where the dead are hurried away, and where missing becomes an everyday condition of the city. In such a setting, what does it mean for an enslaved person to vanish? It can mean escape. It can mean removal. It can mean death. It can mean all of them, and the record may not care which, as long as the labor system continues. This is where the moral demand becomes sharper, because when disaster hits, institutions reveal what they value. In 1793, Philadelphia is a capital city, and yet in the heat of the epidemic, what is preserved first is not a principle. It is the safety of those with power, and the system of slavery inside the executive household does not pause for moral reflection. It adjusts, it shifts location, it redistributes risk downward, it keeps the machinery intact. If you want to understand the horror here, you have to understand what it means to be enslaved in a city during epidemic flight. When free people flee, it is still traumatic. Homes abandoned, families split, fear dictating every decision. But when an enslaved person is moved, it is not called flight. It is called transfer. It is called sending. It is called removal, and it is done without consent. So yes, 1793 is a crisis year for Philadelphia, but it is also a year that amplifies the logic we have already seen in 1791, movement used as control. And this is where the pattern intensifies into something that looks almost like a second ledger, one that doesn't list amounts of money, but amounts of time. Time accumulated toward freedom is treated as an institutional liability. Time broken by travel is treated as a solution, and in a crisis year, time can be broken more easily. This is also where the phrase, silence as policy, stops being an abstract motif and becomes a practical weapon. Because silence is easier to enforce when everyone is afraid. Silence is easier to sustain when normal civic life collapses. Silence is easier to maintain when the city is trying to survive. And silence is exactly what an evasion strategy needs. I want to be clear about what I am accusing here. I am not accusing the historical record of not knowing. I am accusing it of being designed to know certain things, property, cost, liability, reputation, while refusing to know other things. Human suffering, coerced separation, the theft of legal possibility. When the record speaks, it speaks in the voice of management. When it falls silent around the people who were made to be manageable. That is why, when we reach a peak event window like 1793, we must not treat it as scenery. We must treat it as an accelerant, because a system already built to erase can erase faster in chaos. A system already built to substitute can substitute more freely when fewer eyes are watching. And if you think that sounds like a modern indictment, it is, because it is not only a story about how slavery survived in one particular house. It is a story about how institutions learn to protect themselves during crisis by narrowing the definition of what counts. What counts is what can be defended. What counts is what can be filed. What counts is what can be justified. And what does not count, the names, the bodies, the continuous time toward a right, is treated as noise to be managed. This is why the 6-month clock is so central. It exposes the moral lie beneath polite governance. If liberty is real, it is not supposed to depend on a technicality. If liberty is real, it is not supposed to be prevented by a one-day trip across a river. If liberty is real, it is not supposed to be something the president's household can erase with a pretext. And yet that is exactly what happens in the early 1790s, and the crisis of 1793 makes the procedure easier to hide. You may want a villain you can point at. You may want a single moment you can call the turning point. But this story is not built that way. This story is built out of decisions that look minor until you stack them, year after year, and realize they form a structure. 1791. The method is articulated: remove briefly, reset the clock, conceal the purpose. 1793. The city collapses into epidemic fear and the household of power leaves, reducing scrutiny, increasing the ease of movement, widening the space where disappearance can be explained away. And when you understand those 2 years together, you stop seeing this as a complicated past. You start seeing it as deliberate practice. And here is the moral hinge I will not let you step around. We do not honor the past by repeating its comforting stories. We honor it by refusing to let the people who were most vulnerable be reduced to shadows in someone else's paperwork. Remembering is not sentimental. It is responsibility. Because when silence is policy, memory is resistance. And in the next section, that resistance will become visible, not in speeches, not in monuments, but in the most dangerous act an enslaved person can take inside a system built to erase time, refusing to be rotated, refusing to be filed, refusing to be returned. There is a moment in every buried record when the institution is forced to speak. Not because it suddenly grows a conscience, because someone with leverage demands proof, because silence becomes expensive, because the machine depends on secrecy, and secrecy becomes unstable when a person steps outside the schedule. For the president's house in Philadelphia, that moment has a date: May 21st, 1796. That is the day Ona Judge leaves the executive residence and does not return. This is where the story shifts from quiet evasion to open pursuit. Because rotation is one kind of control, it keeps time from accumulating. But escape is different. Escape turns the hidden system into a public problem. Escape produces witnesses. Escape produces rumors. Escape produces the possibility that other enslaved people will try the same thing. In other words, escape threatens the policy, and the institution responds the way institutions respond when their policy is threatened. It escalates. It mobilizes. It writes letters. It tries to convert a human being back into property through paperwork. There are people who want to tell this as a romance of freedom. They want to soften it into a story that ends cleanly. I will not do that, because the receipts show something colder. Freedom here is not granted, it is hunted. After Ona Judge's escape in 1796, Washington Circle begins an effort to recover her, and the language of the correspondence is revealing in a way that should make you uncomfortable. It is not the language of a lost family member. It is not the language of concern for a young woman's safety. It is the language of retrieval, and retrieval requires infrastructure. It requires officials who can act quietly. It requires intermediaries who can apply pressure without making a spectacle. It requires plausible deniability, because the moment you make this too visible, you risk political backlash in a city where anti-slavery sentiment and a free black community are real forces. That is why November 1796 matters. On November 28, 1796, Washington writes to Joseph Whipple, the customs collector in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. The purpose is not ambiguous. Locate Ona Judge, recover her, bring her back. This is the point where the official archive exposes its nature. The official archive is not only the place where presidents conduct affairs of state, it is also the place where presidents conduct affairs of ownership. And ownership, when challenged, becomes coercion that pretends to be administrative. Now, in a story like this, people often ask, why does a letter count? Because a letter is the institution speaking in its own voice. A letter is intent on paper. A letter is the machine documenting its next move. And this letter matters because it shows how the power structure responds when the schedule fails. Ona Judge did what the household's policy was designed to prevent. She turned her presence in Pennsylvania into an irreversible act. She moved from being a managed variable to being a person making a decision, and that is what the institution cannot tolerate, so it uses the tools available: federal influence, personal networks, officials who owe favors, and quiet pressure. This is where leverage enters the narrative, not leverage held by enslavers, but leverage held by the world around them. Because Whipple does not simply obey. He hesitates. He signals that public backlash could follow. There is fear of disturbance, fear of riot, fear of making this too visible. That matters because it reveals something the institution is trying to avoid saying out loud. The public story of liberty cannot easily coexist with the spectacle of a president hunting a woman for the purpose of re-enslavement. So the effort is carried out with restraint, not because the goal is humane, but because the optics are dangerous. That is how silence as policy adapts. When the public eye is near, the institution does not stop. It only gets quieter. This is the part where I want you to recognize a specific pattern of power, because it repeats across centuries. First, the institution creates a private policy that conflicts with public values. Second, it enforces that policy through routine procedure, rotation, removal, euphemism. Third, when the policy fails, when a person escapes, when the truth leaks, the institution does not confess. It denies, reframes, and applies pressure. And only under pressure does it reveal fragments of truth. Not enough to establish full accountability, just enough to regain control. That is why I call these confrontation letters. They are the moments when the system is forced to answer, briefly, before it tries to return to silence. Now widen the lens. Ona Judge is the clearest rupture in 1796, but she is not the only indicator that the system was unstable. By 1797, the Washington presidency is ending, and another critical break occurs. Hercules, the enslaved cook, self-emancipates in February 1797. The significance is not just that he escapes, it is when. By 1797, the household has spent years mastering procedure, removing people to reset legal clocks, managing optics in Philadelphia, treating a human being's residency as a risk. And still the system fails. Still people choose flight over captivity. That is the indictment that cannot be erased with a ledger. Because if the institution's story were true, if the household were benign, if the conditions were tolerable, if the people were well treated, then the rational response would be compliance. But the response we see again and again is refusal. Refusal carries a cost. People do not take that cost unless the system they are leaving is worse. So by 1796 and 1797, the record stops being a quiet description of evasion and becomes something else, a record of a government household trying to reassert ownership over people who have asserted personhood. And now we come to the mechanism behind all of it. Because if you only focus on the escapes, you might treat this as a story of individual courage against individual wrongdoing. That is comforting, and it is incomplete. This is a story about procedure. This is a story about how an institution can do violence without ever sounding violent. It is a story about how silence can be manufactured and maintained. Start with the euphemisms. In the late 18th century, the language of the household does not always say enslaved. It says servant. It says dower. It says belonging to. It says sent. Words that make coercion sound like routine. Words that let a listener mistake captivity for employment. That is not linguistic drift. It is moral camouflage. Then, the classified annexes of that era, the things that are not for public view, not literally stamped classified, not always, but functionally withheld, kept within a circle, discussed privately. The instruction in 1791 to remove people under a pretext, to deceive both the enslaved and the public, tells you exactly how the circle operates. A deception strategy requires compartmentalization. Some people move the bodies. Some people keep the papers. Some people speak the public narrative. No single participant needs to feel like the villain, because the system distributes the act. That is how it protects itself. Now, the missing pages. Sometimes the missing page is literal, a gap in a book, a record that does not survive, a detail never written down. But more often, the missing page is a decision never recorded morally. It is the absence of any acknowledgement that the purpose of the movement was to prevent freedom. It is the absence of the enslaved person's voice. It is the absence of consent, and that absence is not innocent. It is policy. Because if you never write down the true purpose, you create a future where someone can say, "We don't know." You create a future where uncertainty becomes a shield. And that is the cover-up mechanism in its cleanest form, not burning documents, but never documenting the guilt in the first place. Next, the procedural reset. In Pennsylvania, time could become a legal lever. So the household learns to break time, remove a person briefly, return them, reset the clock. In that procedure, you can hear the logic of every later institution that learns to evade accountability by controlling definitions. If a right depends on a condition, residency, employment status, jurisdiction, paperwork, then the powerful can manipulate the condition so the right never triggers. Not by denying the right, by preventing the right from attaching. This is why the horror here is administrative, because administrative horror is scalable. It can be repeated without shouting. It can be taught as best practice. It can be performed by decent-seeming people who tell themselves they are only following procedure. Now, add enforcement. When Ona Judge escapes in 1796, the household does not accept the loss. It attempts recovery through official channels and private pressure, and this reveals another layer of the mechanism, the reach of power. A private person hunting a runaway is one kind of threat. A president using federal networks and personal influence to pursue a woman is another. That reach is the true infrastructure of slavery in the early republic. Not only plantations and chains, but letters, favors, offices, and the quiet assumption that the government's leaders could mobilize state-like power to protect private ownership. This is where the moral sermon is unavoidable, because there is a temptation, always, to treat the founding era as sacred ground, to treat presidents as symbols rather than actors, to treat complicated as a substitute for accountability. But a record like this does not allow reverence to replace responsibility. The record shows intent, the record shows method, the record shows pursuit, and the record shows what the institution wants most: control of the narrative. In Philadelphia in the 1790s, the executive household was not merely living amid the contradictions of its time. It was actively engineering a workaround to keep human beings enslaved in a city where law and community made freedom plausible. That is not a contradiction, that is a strategy. And the reason we have to say it in this tone, ominous, prosecutorial, is because this is what buried records depend on, future generations softening the language until the violence disappears. So we will not soften it. We will keep the years sharp. 1791. Written instruction on how to break the 6-month clock and conceal the purpose. 1793. Epidemic chaos reduces scrutiny and makes movement easier to disguise. May 21st, 1796. Ona Judge escapes, breaking the schedule. November 28th, 1796. The president writes to activate recovery through an official intermediary. February 1797. Hercules self-emancipates, proving again that the system fails when people refuse to cooperate with their own erasure. And we will keep the moral obligation sharper than the institution's euphemisms. If we can name the procedure, we can recognize it when it returns. If we can reconstruct the missing story, we deny silence its final victory. Because silence is not just what happened to the record. Silence is what the record was built to produce. And remembering, accurately, unsentimentally, is the only way to stop the procedure from being repeated under a new name. By the time the 1790s are over, the president's house has done its work. The schedule has been enforced. The paper has done what paper does. It has protected power by making people into management. And then time does what institutions prefer it to do. Time buries the scene. In 1832, the president's house is demolished. The physical structure disappears. The address survives. The legend survives. The convenient version survives. And that is the first reburial, not of bodies, but of responsibility. Because when a building is gone, it becomes easier to pretend what happened inside it was abstract. An era, a context, a complication. People speak about founding without having to stand on the ground where slavery operated as household policy. Then, in the modern era, the ground starts refusing to cooperate. In the early 2000s, Independence Mall is reshaped again, and the Liberty Bell is given a new home. The public story gets rebuilt with glass, brick, and tourism language, heritage, freedom, founding ideals. And in the process of building that polished surface, the older layers reappear, not as a confession, as foundations, as a footprint that says, you can demolish a house, but you cannot demolish what it was. By 2007, archaeological work at the site brings the president's house footprint into public view in a way it had not been for generations. The ground produces what the official story had kept peripheral, the physical evidence that the executive mansion stood here, and with it, the unavoidable fact that slavery stood here too. This is the second discovery. And now watch the pattern repeat, because this is the point where you find out what an institution has truly learned from its own past. The first discovery in the 1790s produced a choice. Exploit a loophole, conceal the purpose, reset the clock, protect reputation. The second discovery in the 2000s produces a parallel choice. Interpret fully or minimize. Name the enslaved or generalize, confront the contradiction, or bury it under visitor experience. And again, the temptation is the same: rebury. Not by shoveling dirt this time, by controlling interpretation, by managing what is said at the most sacred civic site in the city, by acting as if the presence of slavery at the president's house is a sidebar to the national narrative rather than part of its operating system. This is what Discoveries Reburied looks like in the modern vocabulary. It is a meeting where someone says, "We don't want to distract from the Liberty Bell." It is a planning document where slavery is reduced to a paragraph. It is a decision to treat the enslaved as an interpretive challenge instead of as the human cost of the founding's public performance. And it is always justified the same way, not with open denial, but with managerial language. Too complex, too political, not the scope, not the brand, not the moment. But the moment is always now, because the record keeps returning. By 2010, a public memorial exhibit at the President's House site opens, explicitly acknowledging the enslaved people connected to Washington's Philadelphia household alongside the narrative of the presidency. That opening is not simply a cultural event, it is evidence of conflict, because institutions do not widen their stories voluntarily. They widen them under pressure. Pressure from scholars who refuse to let a footnote stay a footnote. Pressure from advocates who refuse to let a foundation be paved over by patriotic convenience. Pressure from the simple stubbornness of facts. So yes, by 2010, the story is more honest than it was a decade earlier. But notice what the very existence of this timeline proves. It proves that even in the 21st century, when the ground itself offers up evidence, the first instinct of power is still containment. Containment of reputational risk, containment of discomfort, containment of the moral cost. That is the continuity. That is the indictment. And this is where the private archive becomes the difference between memory and amnesia. Because public history, left alone, defaults to the version that keeps the line moving and the visitors smiling. The see-through glass box labeled freedom does not like shadows inside it, so the shadows survive elsewhere. They survive in boxes. They survive in drafts that were cut. They survive in photocopies and marginalia and notes that were never meant to be exhibits. They survive in the human archive, because the official archive still tries to keep control of what counts. Here is what the private archive looks like when you stop romanticizing it. It is not treasure. It is labor. It is a historian working through the 1790s correspondence and refusing to accept euphemism as truth. It is someone reconstructing names from fragments because the institution did not bother to preserve full identities. It is someone matching dates, 1791, 1793, 1796, 1797, and forcing the pattern into view. Remove, reset, conceal, flee, pursue, deny. It is also the ugly part, the part the public does not see, the pressure, the bargaining, the quiet censorship that does not call itself censorship. Because when a researcher brings forward the full implication, when they say plainly that the executive household exploited the law, rotated human beings to prevent freedom, pursued fugitives through official channels, someone will inevitably respond with the modern equivalent of pretext. They will not say, "Hide it so we can keep people enslaved." They will say, "Tone." They will say, "Balance." They will say, "We have stakeholders." They will say, "We can't alienate visitors." And then comes the familiar demand: remove the sharpest paragraphs, or you won't get access, you won't get funding, you won't get placement, you won't get the plaque. This is how deleted chapters happen. Not with a bonfire, with a budget, not with a censor's stamp, with a polite email, not with a threat in public, with a consequence in private. And this is where the private archive becomes an ethical act, because someone, often more than one person, makes a choice that echoes across time. They comply enough to keep the project alive, and they keep the cut pages anyway. They save the excised draft. They keep the notes. They store the inconvenient citations. They preserve what the institution asked them to soften. That saved folder becomes a counter-policy, a refusal to let silence as procedure be the last word. And I am telling you this for a reason. Because it is tempting, when you see a memorial open in 2010, to tell yourself the story is resolved, that the institution learned, that the record has been corrected. That is another comforting myth. The truth is harder. The record is always contested because forgetting is useful. Forgetting protects reputations. Forgetting keeps heroes uncomplicated. Forgetting keeps the founding clean. And forgetting is the final stage of the same mechanism we began with in 1791, when the household decided the public must be deceived. The only antidote is deliberate remembrance, not nostalgia, not celebration, accounting. Accounting that is willing to say, this happened here, these years matter, these names mattered. And the gap between the public story and the private policy is not a misunderstanding, it is the shape of power protecting itself. So when the ground speaks in 2007, and when the memorial opens in 2010, do not treat those as triumphs that close the file. Treat them as warnings. Because a discovery is not justice. A discovery is only an opportunity to record honestly or to rebury in a cleaner language. And if we refuse to do the recording, we become the next link in the chain of silence, another generation that benefited from the comfort of not looking too closely at the place where freedom was staged and slavery was scheduled. That is the responsibility, not to be impressed, to remember accurately, to keep what was erased from being erased again. When institutions want to keep a buried record buried, they do not always deny the facts. They change the language. They replace moral vocabulary with technical vocabulary because technical vocabulary sounds neutral. It sounds responsible. It sounds like care. And in the modern era, the most familiar sentence in this entire story is not written in quill ink. It is written in the tone of a report. It goes like this. We recommend against disturbance. Do not excavate. Do not reopen. Treat as sensitive. Manage the risk. That is how the same decision survives into new centuries. The decision is always framed as prudence. The effect is always the same. Keep the record from becoming fully visible. In the 1790s, the method was calendar control. Reset the 6-month clock, remove under a pretext, deceive the enslaved and the public. In the modern era, the method becomes best practice. A technical report does not need to say the word shame. It only needs to say impact. A technical report does not need to name who was harmed. It only needs to name what is at stake. And what is at stake over and over is institutional reputation, packaged as public order, visitor safety, preservation, or sensitivity. Do not misunderstand me. Sometimes not excavating is correct. Sometimes disturbance destroys evidence. Sometimes the ground must be handled with respect. Sometimes do not disturb is the ethical choice. But in a story like this, you do not take do not disturb at face value. You ask, do not disturb for whom? Who benefits from leaving the story partially told? Who benefits from the public never seeing the full accounting? Because we have already watched this technique in the 1790s. We have seen how procedure becomes a weapon when the procedure is designed to prevent a right from attaching. We have seen how a one-day removal becomes a machine for erasing time. We have seen how euphemism becomes cover. So when modern language tells you to avoid disturbance, you are obligated to apply the same skepticism you would apply to a pretext in 1791. Not because every modern decision is corrupt, but because this record has taught us what power does by default. It prefers silence, and it prefers control of narrative. That is the continuity. And now we arrive at the part that requires discipline, what we can prove, what we can infer, and what remains unknown because silence was chosen. First, what we can prove. We can prove that in the early 1790s, Pennsylvania's law created a time threshold that threatened enslavers who brought enslaved people into the state. We can prove that by 1791, the president's household discussed, in writing, how to prevent enslaved people from reaching that threshold by removing them briefly so time would restart. We can prove that this method included concealment. It was to be done under a pretext, with deception aimed at both the enslaved people and the public. We can prove that in 1793, Philadelphia entered crisis during the yellow fever epidemic, and that crisis altered the city's oversight and rhythms in ways that made private household procedures easier to hide in general. We can prove that on May 21, 1796, Ona Judge escaped from the president's house in Philadelphia and refused to return. We can prove that in November 1796, the household moved to recover her through official intermediaries. We can prove that in February 1797, Hercules self-emancipated, demonstrating again that the system did not retain people through consent. We can prove that the physical building was later demolished, and that in the 2000s, the site's history became the subject of renewed public confrontation, forcing a more explicit acknowledgement. Those are not interpretations. Those are the skeleton of the record. Second, what we can responsibly infer. We can infer that the rotation strategy was not a one-time improvisation. The written nature of the instruction, its calm operational tone, shows it was designed to be repeatable. We can infer that this repeatability required coordination, routes, timing, secrecy, the cooperation of staff. Not because everyone had to be a monster, but because the system distributes responsibility in a way that keeps each participant's conscience insulated. We can infer that the household understood the moral optics. That is why concealment mattered. That is why the public had to be deceived. That is why the recovery effort after 1796 had to be handled carefully. And we can infer that the official archive was never intended to preserve the enslaved people as full persons. Their presence appears where management requires it. Their interior lives do not appear, because the archive was built to protect ownership, not to record humanity. Third, what remains unknown. Certain details remain unknown because the people who suffered were denied authorship. Certain details remain unknown because the record keepers did not think the truth was worth writing down. Certain details remain unknown because institutions have always had reasons to keep their most humiliating procedures out of permanent view. And when you accept that, you stop asking the wrong question. The wrong question is, why didn't they write it down? They didn't write it down because writing it down would create accountability. The better question is, what does the record structure tell us about the priorities of the people who made it? And the answer is consistent across the decades. Protect the house, protect the narrative, protect the reputation, at human cost. Now, return to where we began, because a buried record must be closed the way it was opened, not with comfort, but with clarity. In 1791, the line that should not exist is the line that treats freedom as a timer. A human being stays in Pennsylvania. Time accumulates toward a legal claim. The household removes them briefly. Time is ordered to forget. The person returns. The new era begins again. 6 months reset, over and over, until the law's promise is made meaningless. And if you want a definition of silence as policy, that is it. Silence as policy is not only the absence of testimony, it is the production of conditions where testimony cannot mature into consequence. It is the design of procedures that prevent rights from attaching. It is the use of euphemisms that make coercion sound ordinary. It is the strategic narrowing of what counts as a fact worth recording. This story is not a morality play about a distant era. It is a lesson about mechanisms. Because the mechanism did not die with the 18th century, it is still visible wherever institutions manage risk by managing language. It is still visible wherever reputation is treated as an asset more valuable than a human life. It is still visible wherever the public story is curated and the private record is kept behind process. So I will end this the only ethical way such a record can end, by refusing to let the names dissolve into the institution's convenience. Austin, Hercules, Ona Judge, Christopher Shields, Giles, Richmond, Mall, Paris, Joe. Say them without ceremony. Say them without romance. Say them as an accounting. Because what the record did, first, was reduce them to function. What we must do, now, is refuse the reduction. We do not fix the past by building better slogans. We fix the present by learning how the past hid its violence in procedure, and by recognizing the same pattern when it returns with newer paperwork. That is why remembrance here is not optional, it is responsibility. If you stand in Philadelphia and you let the Liberty Bell tell the whole story, you are participating in the policy of silence. If you treat the president's house as merely historic, and not as a site where the executive household engineered a workaround to keep people enslaved, you are assisting the reburial. The founding is not only what was proclaimed, it is also what was practiced, and what was practiced here in the 1790s was not just slavery as inheritance, it was slavery as strategy, and strategy as teachable. So the final question is not, how could they? The final question is, what do we do now that we know the method? Because once the method is visible, pretending not to see it becomes a choice, remembering becomes a duty, and silence, after this, becomes complicity, 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 becomes